as institutions. I mean, that's just one of many ways in which it's defined. And each of our panelists will actually share with you their framework, their understanding, the context in which the systemic racism, the barriers, the biases, the denial of humanity, the lack of dignity, the operational practices that prefer some over others, that negate the talent, that require validation for some and not for others. It is an everyday, ever-present phenomena. And part of what brings us to this conversation writ large is what we've been living through, particularly this past year. We call it a year of confluence of crises. And whether it started out with the humanitarian crisis that we all continue to live through, COVID-19, now going into COVID-20 and 21 and 22. Or we look at the racial strife and the killing of Mr. Floyd. Some say the death, the murder, the dying of a man at the knee of an institutional actor, a government person of responsibility. And so the context in which we come to this conversation is about life and death. It's about the systems and structures. We're not going to be talking so much about the individuals, though we need to recognize the individuals' contribution to systems and policies and practices. And so I wanted to make sure that we share not only, and you'll have all of our panelists will have some video presentations or PowerPoints to present. And again, white privilege versus Black experience, right? The reality, this is a way of life. The challenge for individuals of color, the challenge for Black people. Renee, when I'm an African-American, a Black woman, I use she, her, hers as my pronouns. But this is the world that I live in every day. Can we go to the next slide, please? And again, using this as visuals, because part of what happened to create a greater awareness, a greater desire for conversation, to understand systemic racism, to do something different about it, was it became visceral for more people. It wasn't just words. It wasn't just an article. It was real. It was every day. And it was brought to us over and over and over and over and over again. And people couldn't get away from it because we were held by our TV, our laptops, our iPhones, looking at this. And this is the reality. And how do we, as individuals, as a collective, begin to address the systemic racism that allows for this kind of disparate and different treatment of individuals? And so our panel is going to talk about it. Next one, please. And this is what we aspire to. Right? When we begin to break down these systems and strategies, you know, I got an email from a friend. One of the things I did in my last life was I headed the Presidential Glass Ceiling Commission. And I got an email from a friend that says, make sure you wear shoes because there's a lot of glass on the floor. And this is a picture of the little girl's shadow was on busing. And Brown versus Board of Education, and past how it foresees these can indeed predict our future when there's a deliberate intentionality. But the challenge is, how do we make this more than one? How do we expand the opportunities? How do we remove the barriers that denied for so many years the recognition and the value of individuals, of women of color? And so with that, I'd like to be able to ask Damon, please, would you like to open us up?
Absolutely. Would you like, I can share my screen here. So you know, I think you summed everything up beautifully. This issue of systemic racism is a heavy one. It's a big topic. It touches so many lives in so many different ways. And I think it's really, as I've started to kind of get my head around this and try to bring awareness to, the organization that I support, and to cultivate conversation around this topic, I found it really valuable to share what are some of the cumulative impacts of systemic racism. Not everybody's fully aware of, statistically what this means, and how significant the gap has been over with the years and years of generational impact on, particularly people of color and blacks in America. So this slide kind of summarizes some of those data points that have now come out, through this year of that we've been going through. There's been so much information coming forward, and this is just a quick summary of some of the things that I think are worth sharing. And I think it was enlightening for us, my organization, to kind of go through this, and it definitely woke some people up. And so starting up top with the median net worth of Black households, the gap, the wealth gap, and many of you, I'm sure, have heard of this. $17,150 for Black households versus median net worth of white households, 171,000. Huge discrepancy, right? But and you think about what you need to be successful in America. You need income. You need to be part of the financial process. And when it comes to building credit and buying homes, and it just opens education. I mean, so much healthcare, a lot's tied to this. So to see that gap is really stark. But what's really interesting to me, and what was shocking to me personally, was the last sentence around the gap. This gap has remained consistent over the past 70 years. So even with all of the reform, with the changes in public policies, there's still this gap that has remained in play over what many would view as moments of progress. And there has been progress made, but you would assume it would be equivalent. You would see it here in this metric, and it's not there. And the question is why? And that goes back to the issues that we're discussing today. A few other data points, which was also shocking to me. Black professionals. There's a great report that was done on kind of the Black experience in corporate America, and 3.3% of all executive or senior leadership roles are held by Black professionals. Extremely low when you think about the big picture. And only 8% of all professional levels roles in corporate America are held by Black professionals. Once again, very low numbers there. For every 100 entry-level men promoted to manager, only 58 Black women get the same recognition. So that gap just keeps getting bigger and bigger if you just do the math. In 2018, Black women made 62 cents for every dollar as white men in similar jobs. So the pay equity gap, something that we've seen progress, but there's still a lot more work to be done there. When you look at board of directors, very low participation with the Fortune 500s and the Russell 3000. Going to the other side of this slide, home ownership rates. That's something my organization is really interested in trying to improve upon moving forward and do our part. And you see, at the bottom, 47% of African Americans own homes compared to Caucasians, who are there 76%. And then you go a little bit deeper in the housing space. There's recent research that shows that several major cities indicate homeowners pay 10 to 13% higher taxes, even though they're in the same proximities. For some reason, minorities pay more in taxes. Something else to dig into. The mortgage approval rates, very low. 2.6 times are less likely to be denied. Blacks are more likely to be denied for conventional mortgages in comparison to whites, and even on the refinances. Previously approved purchasers are still denied at a higher rate. And of course, we see all with the George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, the data point around, Black men are 2.5 times more likely to be killed by police. We hear of all the, what we've seen throughout the summer, but it still has continued. There's still stories that are coming out on a regular basis, which are concerning. And I'm sure there's an area that, I found interesting that I'm sure Marcy would go into a little bit around the Black experience in the hospitals. 41% less likely to get pain medication in comparison to whites. Once again, why is that the case? And it goes back to this deep-rooted issue of systemic racism. we go to the tech side. So through my research on IDC and given the nature of Witty, I'm sure this is not brand new information. There's been lots of information or effort around, moving the needle from a demographic perspective, particularly for women and African Americans. And this data chart kind of shows what progress has been made, for women over the last few years for some of the major large tech companies. But you see in comparison, African Americans still very low. And then if you look over to the right, in 2019, women comprised about 11% of tech jobs, and of that, Black women represent 3%. So still lots of upside, even though there's been a lot of energy and effort put into this for the last 10 years or so. There's just a lot of effort to be made. So that's what I wanted to share, just kind of to help with the level set that the data is starting to show that there's clear opportunities, and we have to figure out, really take very deliberate actions to truly move the needle and take a holistic approach to this and not just scratch the surface.
Thanks, Damon. Thanks you so much on that. Let me turn to Marcy, since you mentioned Marcy in the area, particularly around health. And we think about the pandemic, right? What's front and center for health, how that is so fundamental. So please.
Absolutely. When you think about healthcare and systemic racism, it may be sometimes difficult to sort of draw the direct line between healthcare and systemic racism, because we all often think it's about our individual choices, about whether I'm healthy, whether my socioeconomic status gives me access to healthcare. Mm-hmm. But really, I think I found some fascinating information regarding how historically racism has been built into the healthcare system, and now through unconscious bias and other systems that we don't see it. Just to share a couple of interesting yet disturbing facts, and there was a fascinating dossier on NPR this week just so happened to cover this. But for instance, just comparing historically and today, and to show you how systemic racism is really built in and planted early. So in the mid 1800s, it was widely believed in the medical community that Black people didn't feel pain or anxiety. Okay. And as my colleague Damon has already referenced, today, Black patients consistently are undertreated for pain medication. In the 19th century, Dr. Marion Sims, who's the father of gynecology and has received wonderful accolades for the instruments that he developed that are still used today. But what's less told is that he did his research and surgical procedures on enslaved women without anesthesia, without pain medication, excuse me. And so that's in the 19th century. Today, in the early 2000s, it was discovered in a California prison that they were performing sterilization against Black and brown prisoners without their consent. So from then to there, and then lastly, just a final comparison to the past and the future. In 1930s through 1972, in which by then I was born, the Tuskegee syphilis experiment. Mm-hmm. That was an experiment done for basically 40 years, 1932 to 1972. And I would imagine most of us were alive during that period, where Black men were told that they were receiving free health care from the federal government, when in fact they were being injected with live syphilis virus. And now we hear the COVID vaccination, and on the news, some people may scratch their heads about why are Black and brown communities distrustful of the COVID vaccination. And so I just share these historical perspectives to juxtapose those to current events, to just show how those elements of systemic racism have really just bled through in our communities. And so really wanted to share that as well.
Well, now I really am, I've had goosebumps as you were speaking, not realizing the depth and the recognition of the currency mm-hmm. Of this devastating system and structures. Dr. Kimberly, please.
Thank you. And this is such a great transition. As I mentioned, I'm focused on historical context of, one of the things I want to think about and talk about today is the fact that I think we need to also center sex and sexual harassment as part of systemic racism. I think sexual harassment, sexual assault are DEI issues. So I think we should talk about that. A couple other things I want to make sure that we have time to talk about are the role of white women. So a lot of times people will say people of color and white women as if the concerns and issues are the same, when in fact, white women have often been a barrier to change, when throughout time, white women have stood against progress for African Americans. So that's something my research reveals. My new book is about the history of women's voting rights. And I have a couple of slides to show, but one thing to remember there, maybe I'll go ahead and share my screen, is that the 19th Amendment didn't pass Congress because anyone thought it would enfranchise Black women in the South. It only passed Congress because everyone knew it wouldn't. So the picture here is the signing ceremony for the 19th Amendment. I just wrote the biography of this woman here, Helen Hamilton Gardner, and you'll notice that all the suffragists are white, right? And like my colleague, Martha Jones, the great historian whose new book, Vanguard, talks about African American women's contribution, says every time we say suffrage, we're basically saying white women, because that's what it meant. And that's how this story plays out. White women made a devil's bargain to get the 19th Amendment through Congress. The 19th Amendment did not enfranchise Black women in the South in reality. It did on paper, but not in reality. Black women in the South were not enfranchised until the 1965 Voting Rights Act. So even among progressive white women, there's been a resistance to working side by side with African American women and other women of color. And I think that's something we need to think about. How can we best be allies? How can we deal with this long history of systemic racism in which we as white women have participated in? Also among the antis, women who oppose women's rights. The reason that women oppose women's rights, from women's voting rights to the Equal Rights Amendment to their voting choices in 2016 and 2020, often has to do with race, right? White women have tended to pick their racial privilege over what is best for women. So I think we need to add that into the mix of things we're talking about today. So that's what my research is sort of the history of women's rights. I also wanted to say a word about higher education, since we're talking about systemic racism, institutional racism. One of the institutions, or at least the institution that I'm most familiar with, is college and universities. So how does institutional racism play out in colleges and universities? Well, I teach this class almost every semester. It's an intro class that students take to fulfill a requirement. And it's called Defining the American Dream. And these are the pictures I have on my syllabus. But what I say to the students on the first day is, if you are here at Miami University and you are not working 2 jobs, and if you are not taking on tens of thousands of dollars of student loans, it's probably because your grandparents or great-grandparents owned their own home. And thanks to intergenerational transfers of wealth, meaning your grandparents pass on, and even if their house was a modest 3-1, Levitt home, they still are leaving your parents $200,000, which means you get to go to college without taking on tens of thousands of dollars of debt. This is sort of news to students, right? People like to think, I'm here because everything I did myself as an individual puts me here. And that is sort of true and sort of not true, right? So I'm trying to help white students see, because my university population is predominantly white, the ways in which the systems, the institutions perpetuate inequality and perpetuate white privilege. So in this class, we talk about the GI Bill. That's the bill that led to the growth of the middle class in the 20th century among white people and ethnic whites like Italians, who were previously considered not exactly white, but were sort of roped into white by the GI Bill because they qualified for affordable home loans, right? And now they're in the middle class. African American veterans who had served bravely, sacrificed everything in World War II, were not afforded this under the GI Bill. They did get some other benefits from the GI Bill, but not home ownership. And like Damon told us, home ownership is the greatest way in which intergenerational wealth is transferred, right? So this is, I think, from the same report that Damon cited. from the Federal Reserve, their September 2020 report about intergenerational wealth and race, showing the ways in which white Americans, white families have a hugely disproportionate amount of intergenerational transfers of wealth, again, largely through home ownership. Why? The GI Bill, which allowed white veterans to buy homes and not veterans of color. So that's one thing that I really center in my class. I teach my kids who are 7 and 9, you may see them popping in, about this through Monopoly. I know this is really controversial, but when we play Monopoly, we play with free parking. So if you land on free parking, you get all the money that's in free parking, which could really be a game changer. So I say to my kids, right, this is what it's like when you start life with $300,000 in your bank account. That opens up a lot more doors. Then you get to buy Boardwalk and Park Place, right? So this is one thing that we need to think about in the way in which it impacts access to higher education. Beyond just getting into college, students of color experience college differently often in terms of majors. Students who don't come from families with a lot of money tend to pick majors that are tied one-to-one with a job that you get right out of college, right? They don't major so much in philosophy or history because maybe if you take out $300,000 of student loans, you don't have the luxury to major in something that doesn't have a job title in it, right? So this may seem like a good idea at first. You immediately get a job after college, but it's not necessarily a job that's going to provide entry into law school or graduate school or these bigger jobs later in life. Also, it's not maybe a job or a major that corresponds with your heart's best interests, with what you really truly care about and are interested in. It's more vocational. Another way in which we see systemic racism in college is through fraternities. So this cuts across race and sex. So fraternities shape social life on colleges, except for in ways that benefit white students. Obviously, there are fraternities at HBCUs, that's a different story. But in terms of campuses that are majority white, fraternities shape the social sphere and still, even when they are integrated, promote institutional racism. And I also teach a class called Me Too, A Cultural History, where we read and zoomed with the author of this great book called Sexual Citizens. I highly recommend it. It's a landmark study of sex, power, and assault on campus. And these authors really study what they call sexual geographies. Who has the power and the money to host the parties on campus? How does this shape students' experiences of college? How does this determine who is assaulted and who is not assaulted? And by and large, fraternities and upper class white men are the ones who host the parties. So all this is to say that systemic racism shapes various aspects of college. In my Me Too class, we also talk about sexual assault as a long-standing tool of white supremacy. So like Marcy was saying, we talk about the role of gynecology in slavery. You may or may not know that after 1808, the US banned the importation of slaves. So how was slavery perpetuated throughout until 1865 when the Civil War ended? Through the rape, sexual assault, and reproductive labor of enslaved Black women. This is where gynecology takes hold. So we read a great book by a woman named Deirdre Cooper Owens called Medical Bondage, where she traces precisely the systems that Marcy was talking about and the ways in which gynecology developed as a specialty, non-consensually and without anesthesia on enslaved Black women. How does that pertain to today? Well, like Marcy and Damon said, in terms of just one example, in terms of the maternal health comes experienced by pregnant women of color. So these are some of the things I hope we can talk about. And one thing I want to just leave with is a cornerstone of my teaching, and especially of my Me Too class, is the concept of intersectionality. And I can put the link to Kimberly Crenshaw's TED Talk in the chat, but intersectionality is the theory that we can't just talk about race, we can't just talk about sex, we can't just talk about sexual identity, but all of these forms of oppression are interlocking. So we need to think about the ways in which they work together. Thank you.
Wonderful, great, thank you. Thank you. So I want to have all the panelists come off, get on the mic, come off of mute so we can have a conversation. And you know, listening to you all, I've had goosebumps the whole time. I don't know whether that's out of just getting further irritated by the prevalence and the sense that while we've made progress, we haven't really made any progress. We see the same structures kind of transforming themselves. And as we talk about reinventing our future, how do we reinvent our future when we have this kind of societal, structural, institutional, legal, legislative obstacles? What are some things that we can do? Who can fix us?
Well, I'm happy to speak first. This is Marcy. I think as it relates to healthcare, I think for people for members in the minority community to feel comfortable speaking up. I mean, once you get into sort of a healthcare environment, the institutional hierarchy enters, right? I mean, my mother will barely question a doctor because he or she has on a white coat. But really, I think for us to learn to really challenge what we're hearing and to get second opinions. In my case in point, even in my current organization, I was in particular looking for an African-American physician because of the importance of cultural competence. And I went through years of having sort of a low white blood count, was terrified for years because I didn't know what that meant. Years back, went to my primary care physician who I selected, who happened to be African-American. And she mentioned to me at my first visit, oh, that's very common in African-Americans. You don't have anything to worry about, right? And so just being in the healthcare system, understanding that you have to advocate for yourself because the default is really designed around white male men bodies, even for women for heart attacks. So I think that's definitely one. But I think secondly, bringing visibility and really questioning those things that don't feel right. But I think it requires all of us to do it. But I think from an African-American perspective, for us to be aware that healthcare disparities exist. It does not matter that I'm a chief human resources officer. It doesn't matter that I live in a lovely part of the country. It's very likely that if I were to enter into a healthcare space with a woman who's white, with half my income and less education, it's more likely that her healthcare outcome could come out better than mine if I weren't active and advocating throughout my care experience. And that's unfortunate, but I think it's a reality.
Great, thank you.
Yeah.
Someone else, I see folks leaning forward to speak, so just speak up here, please.
Yeah, I would just add that, I mean, there's so many areas to start with, and I think employment is an important space. When we talk about the wealth gap piece, the getting access, equal access to similar opportunities, employment opportunities, and really corporate America can play a really active role in this fight. But they have to be deliberate in how they do that. And first, they got to start at home. They have to look internally and see, are they putting the proper mechanisms, the proper infrastructure? Are they tearing down previous practices and that have, perpetuated the issues of inequality in the workplace? I think that, in addition, it's great to see all the acknowledgments by so many companies out there. And behind that, there is action for some of those companies. Some of it is lip service, but there are definitely activities. There's been this heightened awareness. And I think people need to use that as an opportunity to develop an informed perspective about what's really going on. And don't just let it happen around them, because that's the only way you're going to learn to drive this type of change. You have to lead with personal conviction. There has to be a changing of the heart to a certain degree that, hey, this isn't right. And I'm going to do my part in my little space to help move the needle in the right direction. And the cumulative impact of all those actions will start to leak outside the walls of the organization when they're doing it well internally, and then showing and modeling the way externally, and really creating opportunities to connect with other companies, other not-for-profit organizations that are of a similar mindset to say, hey, we can make a change here and reimagine the future and go after that vision with vigor.
Wonderful, great, thank you. As you said that, it made me think of a couple of things. One, on how do institutions align the values they espouse with their actual workplace practices. Don't talk about we believe in diversity and then you have a board that looks not like any of your market, if nothing else, if that's the motivating factor. You know, how do you have a workforce where there's unequal pay and lack of pay equity or access to career developmental opportunities? Or how do you have a workplace in which even in your staff meetings, individuals come up with and not make a statement, not recognized, someone else makes a statement, and then they get credit for it. Usually the white male will get credit for it. A statement made by someone, a woman, a person of color, a person with a disability, and that statement is ignored. So the question is also not only what can we do as institutions, but importantly, what do we do as individuals within an institution so that our collective behavior has impact on the institutions and the structures within our workplace. Kimberly, I see you shaking your head.
Oh yeah, well, I have many thoughts on this. To your particular individuals, I was department chair for a while, and so that would happen to me all the time, right? I say something, or then so what I did was I sort of bonded together with another woman who was department chair, and we amplified each other. So when that happened to her, her name was Anita. So no one acknowledged her comment, but then a white man said it. And they said, "Oh, great idea, Bob." I would say, actually, Anita said that 5 minutes ago, and I really liked it when Anita said, so she didn't have to do it herself, and she did the same for me. This broader question.
I do appreciate that. That's a critical piece, a tool. That's use your voice. What Marcy?
Use your voice. And in terms of institutionally, I think, again, for anyone involved in a DEI effort, I think DEI also needs to take sexual harassment really seriously. And we need to also keep sexual assault, sexual harassment as part of this conversation, especially because of the ways in which it's been used as a tool of white supremacy and the way in which it impacts women of color in the workplace more so than white women. And the university setting, how this plays out a lot is universities, including my own, have these high, prominent DEI initiatives. Maybe we'll hire a DEI vice president at $250,000 a year. Same time that we decimate our curriculum, we close Black World Studies program, we don't retain our faculty of color, and then students are taking classes on marketing, right? So, because that sounds jobby. So I think in education, we really need to center and keep our core mission of education, of keeping our history classes, of keeping our philosophy classes, of keeping our women's studies, of keeping our African-American studies classes, which are really the places where students learn, especially white students, learn about the history of systemic racism. How and why did this come to be the case in our country?
Great, thank you. I see we have some veterans here. Marcy,
Yes.
both of my brothers were Air Force. My mom was Women Army Corps, and my dad was in the Army. My mom's currently interned at Arlington National Cemetery as one of the women that advocated for women in the military memorial.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wonderful. Wow.
Yeah. But again, we talk about the intersectionality, and again, part of this too, when we think about our veterans, right?
Yes.
And the systemic racism. And as you talked about the GI Bill and the healthcare, say some more. Say some more, 100 topics.
Well, we recently had once a month at Stanford Children's, a member of the executive team will host a diversity, equity, and inclusion focus group, and the subject changes month to month, depending on what's happening. But anyway, last month we had a focus group for our veterans, and it was absolutely amazing to hear just their experience from a diversity, equity, and inclusion perspective of military. I mean, the military, it's one of the first institutions that integrated, and certainly has been on the forefront in a lot of ways. And systemically and institutionally, racism built into the military experience, whether it depends on what job you receive, if you're on the flight line or if you're at a desk. I think all of those are really, really interesting and fascinating. And when I was joining the Air Force, actually my brother was in the Navy. I have 4 older brothers, and my oldest brother was in the Navy and told me to join the Air Force. But he gave me the best advice. He suggested that when I went to the Air Force recruiter, that I get in my contract a guaranteed administrative job. I was an 18-year-old kid from St. Louis. I had no idea. That was my first negotiation. But had he not told me that, but the reason he told me that was so that I would be ensured that I received a desk job, a 7 to 5 job, and that would allow me to go to school at night. And that the individuals who go in and they don't specify, which most kids wouldn't know to specify, end up working night shift on the flight line or a job that really doesn't translate outside. I was extremely fortunate that the desk job that I ended up was personnel. And who knew, you know, in 1989, I didn't know what personnel was, but just that one sense of advice that my brother, and I was fortunate that he was able to give me counsel. But you think of how many individuals or minorities go into the military really with no guidance, just with the desire to get a role that doesn't translate. And so I was very fortunate in that respect, but not everyone has that same experience. And so I think the military has lots of wonderful experiences, but it also it undercuts a lot of ways for people of color and minorities that are less evident.
Right, and that's the insidiousness of it, and why these conversations become so important to begin to awaken us, right? To be more attuned, to be more receptive, to be more curious. Damon, you've talked about the notion of leadership in addressing systemic racism. What other critical actions, you know, if you had to give 3 top things you would expect leadership to demonstrate relative to abating systemic racism, what are some of those things?
I think it's first and foremost leading with purpose and personal conviction. You know, going out, understanding the environment you're in, bringing awareness to the issue, and setting a really clear purpose. And that requires reimagining things. You know, breaking the mold, reimagining what the workplace could look like or what your environment should look like moving forward, and setting that clear expectation and staying committed to it. Secondly, it's building genuine connections, particularly with the ones I've referred to in my article as the invisible few. As African Americans, there's this tendency to not speak up. There's a tendency to want to just accept it for what it is because nothing will ever change. It's almost like this learned helplessness at times will settle in. And so there's a community there that's looking for that opportunity to speak up and be heard, and creating an environment where people feel like they can genuinely be heard and that their concerns will be dealt with accordingly. I think is a critical role for any leader in any organization to build that, what we call a speak up culture. And I think thirdly, it's then taking deliberate actions. So you take all the information you've gained from yourself, your own personal reflections, and that personal perspective that you've developed, the information from the employees around you, and then put it into action. And that really, and it has to be done in a holistic way. I think a lot of companies struggle with actually gaining a lot of traction with DE&I efforts because they may focus on recruitment, but they don't go with development, advancement, or retention. You don't look at the full employee experience. And until you take a step and look at that full employee experience, there's low-hanging fruit in every single area, and you gotta find that synergy there. So and finding a way to tie that into your core management practices is paramount. I've done that in past lives where it's a continuous improvement effort. So you hear about the MEG, lean. It's an initiative that should be applied in the same way that you would attack any other business problem. Apply the same tools and resources to this issue, and grow it from there. So those are probably the 3 big things.
Thank you so much. You know, one of the things I was part of a program called Rockwood Leadership Institute, and one of the things that I learned was that we lead from within, and that we all are leaders, right? And so what you just shared for institutional leadership, actually each person could apply for themselves. You know, lead within your span of control, lead within your sphere of influence, lead within your role, lead within your community. We all have an opportunity to lead. And so applying that consistently becomes part of the way in which we begin to address begin to address the systemic bias, the systemic racism, the institutional negation of humanity and full dignity. Marcy and Kimberly, what are some actions, we talk about reinventing our future. What are some things we need to do to reinvent our future with regard to dismantling systemic racism? I feel like in order to invent our future, we got to dismantle systemic. Otherwise, we're not truly reinventing. We're just noodling around the edges again. But what do we have to do?
Kimberly, I'll let you go first.
Oh, thanks, Marcy. Okay. The thing I've been thinking about throughout today's discussion and really throughout all of 2020 is voting rights. So as I mentioned, I wrote a book this year about suffragists because 2020 is the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment. But many Americans don't know that our Constitution does not guarantee all citizens, the right to vote. We have a hodgepodge of laws saying, oh, you can't discriminate based on race or you can't discriminate based on sex. But as we especially in recent elections, there are a whole host of other ways in which and state governments discriminate essentially based on race for voters. So the history of voting rights in the US is the history of the lengths to which white leaders will go to keep African Americans from the polls. So one, I think, primary change, because one way that systemic racism could be overturned is by changing laws. So what we need is a universal voting rights act. The House passed one last year that says citizenship equals voting rights. All citizens get to vote, and also all citizens should have easy access to the polls. So many of our states and municipalities make it hard to vote. Oh, you have to go only at these certain times. Oh, your polling place, the lines are around the block. No, there are many ways in which our voting system could be improved and made more accessible for all citizens. And that's a big one for me.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you. Marcy, please.
Yeah, I would add to that. I think systemic racism cannot be deconstructed without our white allies. I think it's absolutely critical that if African American and brown people could have done it by themselves, it would have been done, right? And so what we see in history is that change has only occurred when our white allies have stood with us and led with us in these areas. And I think in these current times, really engaging and inviting our white colleagues to join us in the fight, to bring their voices to the conversation, to speak up for your colleague and to really bring them into the conversation. I have to say, having seen after George Floyd murder, I was just astounded to see across the country, across the world, how many allies that were not Black or brown who were standing in the gap. And that was so heartfelt. And I think that's what we have to continue to do. One, to make this a safe conversation and recognize that it is an uncomfortable one, but that we need everyone and we need our allies to stand with us to really move the needle.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you. A couple of things. How much time do we have left? I'm looking at my watch. I want to be able to do some questions.
You've got 10 minutes left.
Okay, so we're all right. We're good, folks. We're good. Can some of the panelists, can you all see any of the questions in the chat? I know there was a question earlier specifically to you, Damon. There was a question there specifically for you, but I also wanted to comment on the linkage around the sexual harassment and the gender piece. Because oftentimes, as Kimberly said, oftentimes when we think of suffrage and we think of women's rights, it's white women. And yet, when I headed the Presidential Glass Ceiling Commission, what we heard from women of color was we get counted by organizations in two categories. We counted to increase the number of women, female representation, and even now, as we change and reinvent our future, moving beyond the binary construct. Let me just caveat that right up front. We do need to be able to move beyond the binary construct, right? And we identify women and then by your race. And that's the intersectionality. And yet we are identified and elevated the numbers in both categories. And so my response was, well, do we get paid twice? No, right? The notion of the twofer, and that if you want to address racism, indeed, you have to also address the issue around gender identity. as well. It's not one or the other. Did you want to just say something? And Damon, did you find that question?
Yeah, I see it here around the establishing D&I versus creating a safe space for people of color by leadership. I think the way I would, if I'm reading interpreting the question correctly, I think that creating that safe space is just a component of an overall D&I strategy. I think it's a critical component. It's a mechanism to get the right information in tow as a leader to understand what you're working with, because every organization has different challenges depending on, because we're all individuals, right? And we've all had very different experiences. So it's just a piece of the overall strategy. I think D&I is about action. If there's not action being taken, particularly across those four, that the recruitment, advancement, development, and retention of staff, about that life cycle, then it's just noise, honestly, because you're not moving the needle in the right direction. So the safe space is just a component of the overall strategy, in my opinion.
And I would also add on that, we do a lot of work around, and we often talk about brave space as opposed to safe space, because what might be safe for some may not be safe for others. And that also takes into the context of